Welcome and thank you for joining Communication Techniques to be Heard presented by Digineer. My name is Jack Thiesing and I will be your moderator today. I would like to introduce today's speaker. Lucinda Dutoit is the VP of Human Resources at Digineer. Her work at Digineer is about ensuring that all employees are able to challenge, stretch, and achieve more than they thought they could. This all starts with communication. Lucinda coaches individuals on how to understand others' communication so that they can be more successful. If you have questions, please type them in the Q&A feature of this webinar. Also, as you can see, Lucinda is broadcasting with her webcam. Zoom has options that allows you to change how you see her during the presentation. And now I'll turn the presentation over to Lucinda.
Good morning, everyone. I'm excited to actually do this presentation. So I hope everybody is ready for questions. I hope everybody is ready to engage in some dialogue because it's now time to actually figure out how other people communicate so you can communicate better with them. So today we're going to go over a number of different areas. And each one of these areas is to give you context of how people communicate. And at the very end, we're going to pull it all together so you can kind of read what people are thinking so you can close those gaps. So the first part that we're going to be talking about, and by the way, if you have questions, please put the questions in chat. Jack will be taking care of the chat, and I will also allow time at the end of this for questions. So for starters, communication influences. Everybody's brain works in a little bit different way. And this is based on 5 different areas of their experience and what they've experienced in their life. One of the first areas is somebody's core values. What do they believe strongly in? Like, for instance, I believe strongly in respecting every individual for who they are. So that's going to affect my communication. The next part is attitudes. So this is taking somebody's core values and it changes into how they think, also how they behave. So taking into consideration respect for every individual. When I go to a restaurant with the waiter or waitress, I say please and thank you and ask them how their day. That's how I behave in showing respect for other individuals. Core behaviors. This is the way we act based on our strong beliefs, which is based on our core values. And then moderate behaviors. So there's core behaviors and then there's moderate behaviors. Core behaviors is instilled in your core values. Moderate behaviors are sometimes that give and take, where in different situations, you might change your behavior based on what you're experiencing. So if the waiter is rude to me, while I respect every individual, I'm also going to stand up for myself and not take somebody being rude to me or my husband or guests that I have at the table. Environment. So we all experience different environments. So, and this is where we work. This is where we live, where we have grown up to where we currently live. And so these are the habits that you have built over the years. It is also the habits that you have learned to be successful in your current position or in your past positions. So now that we understand the influences, we're going to go into different types of communication. And you will see this all over the place. So one type is passive. And so I want us to go back to the restaurant analogy. So let's pretend that you're working with a group of people and you're all deciding to go out to lunch. And an example of passive communication is when you're asking, where do you want to go to lunch? And the person says, oh, really doesn't matter. I'm open to Mexican, Indian, Thai. I would even go for sushi. So that's somebody who wants somebody else to make the decision, and they're indifferent. They yield to others. Another type of communication is passive aggressive. So passive aggressive is that person is saying, I can do Mexican, Thai, and I can even go for sushi. But down deep, they really want to go for sushi, but everybody else chooses Thai. So then they're frustrated that they're not going to sushi. They go to Thai, but they don't really say anything. They just really want to go for sushi, and they keep telling other people behind their back or making subtle comments, I wish I would have done sushi. There's also aggressive. So this is hear it, see it. You are not going to question one way or another what this person wants. And the restaurant example again would be, I don't want to go for Mexican or Thai. I want to go for sushi. We're going to sushi. So that is aggressive. They're telling everybody else where they're going and they're going to get their way. Now, assertive, that is open. They want to hear everybody else's ideas. They collaborate with the team, and everybody is welcome to say which direction they want to go, and they're respectful to the other individuals. So let's go back to the restaurant. They would say, I'd really like to go for sushi. I'm open to the other areas if somebody else has a preference for that, but otherwise I would actually suggest sushi. So it's still opening other people into the conversation, but they're being very clear about what they would prefer. So now we're going to go into our two polls. Based on these two polls, I will actually address and communicate to you guys based on what the poll results are. So you'll see a little bit of a change in the presentation and what I talk about next.
Thank you to those that I see that are answering the poll. I'm just going to give it a few more seconds to get your answers in. I know that there's 2 questions there. All right, 3 more seconds and I'm going to share the results. Here we go.
Wonderful. So we've got passive, we've got assertive, and passive aggressive and passive are the hardest ones for people to communicate with. So I'm going to kind of work our communication dialogue into those specific areas. So I will address how you work with passive and passive aggressive people. So let's move on to communication tools. So communication tools, what you're seeing is the DISC model. And the DISC model is something that a lot of people utilize to really understand how somebody communicates. So if somebody is dominant, they're direct and to the point. You will see assertive people actually using dominance, but they will also use the influence. They will use a combination of those. Those that are aggressive tend to use more of the dominance and purely the dominant side. Whereas once again, assertive people use a combination of the influence and the dominance. Steadiness is pace. They're slower, they're deliberate. It's not good or bad, it is just the way they communicate. And learning how to communicate with individuals with more of a deliberate path is going to be important to those that are a little bit more assertive in regards. You tend to see passive people be more in the steadiness quadrant. Compliance is all about procedures and policies, using direct facts, using data, and that's how they make their decisions. So we're going to take the DISC model a little bit further, and we're going to talk about how these individuals actually communicate. So if somebody has a D or does their communication by a strong D, they're going to be motivated purely by goals and completing tasks. At times you will see them impatient and they're going to make quick decisions. They're going to be, let's go, let's go, let's go. So going back to the restaurant analogy, they're going to be going for sushi. We're going at 11:30. Let's go now because it's going to take about 10 minutes for us to get there. And we want to be there at 11:30 to actually beat the crowd. So their goal is going to lunch. Somebody who leads their communication with influence will be listening to what everybody else needs. How do we get there? Who wants to drive? Let's talk about how we get there quickly. And you will notice they have very strong verbal skills and they're pulling everybody into the communication. So those of you that have an assertive style for communicating, you will combine that dominance and that influence to get people to that next phase. And it's about driving the results, but driving the results with an ability to collaborate with people. So individuals who have a high S, they just want to please others. So you'll see a lot of passive individuals in this area. Once again, it's not good or bad. It's just, this is how they communicate. So you'll see effective listening. You'll see them talking, but not necessarily making the decisions. And those individuals with high C, it's about the flat facts that are coming. It's about planning. So you will see those individuals grouping everybody together to plan to go to lunch. And it's very much about details. So if you're talking to somebody with a higher C or a higher S, and you're an assertive person that has a high I, use facts versus just your opinion, because the facts will really help you communicate with those individuals with a high C. So now there's other components we're adding to that DISC model. And we're adding to that DISC model, and we're talking about another piece. Who are task focused, who are active, who are people focused, and who are reflective. So active means they just move forward and they're constantly moving forward. Reflective means I'm going to sit back and think about the facts and what is the best way to go about and plan. So another way to look at this is when it comes to, let's talk about Minnesota. Minnesota has a ton of lakes. And those individuals that are active base, they're going to go to the lake, they're going to see the dock, they're going to see the water, and they are going to run off that dock and they're going to jump in the water without even thinking about it. So even if there's alligators in there, those on the reflective side, they're going to sit back and think, okay, what are the possibilities of an alligator actually being in that lake? So I'm going to walk down to that lake and I'm going to look into the lake. I'm going to put my toe in the water and see how cold it is. And then I'm going to jump in because I've planned everything. I know what I'm going to get. I know what I'm going to do. And once again, one area of communication is not right. One is not wrong. They're just different types in how our brain is wired. You'll also see those that are task focused versus people focused. And what this means is the the ability to think through tasks and get the task done is the most important factor. So those that have a high D and a high C are going to be much more about the task and how the task is done and how quickly it is accomplished, whether it's just jumping in and accomplishing it or whether it's planning and accomplishing it. High S's and high I's is more about the people that they're interacting with. They still want to accomplish goals, but they want to accomplish it through the individuals that they actually work directly with. Your individuals with a high S, those are your people pleasers. They want to make sure that everything is going well. Those with a high I, they're going to want to make sure that they're getting everybody on board and motivating people to actually complete the task. So individuals with a high D, these are some of the traits. So the traits above are things that are very positive about this. The ones below the line, this is how they can come across sometimes. It is not their intention to come across as demanding or domineering. It is more about getting the task done and getting it done quickly. So keep that in mind. When you see somebody that seems to be a little demanding, it's not that their intent is to make you feel uncomfortable. It's about accomplishing that task. So in your own head, instead of creating a communication gap, think, oh, they just want the task done. So how quickly can we get it done? Individuals with high I's, you're going to see them motivating everybody to get the task done and to get things done. You're going to see them really being interactive and extremely collaborative and wanting to pull more and more people in. And they'll be moving at a fast pace, just so you're aware. But sometimes they're going to be very impulsive. So a good combination for somebody who has high I is a high C, because the C will actually help them plan. So a good combination for a high D is somebody who has a high I, but also has a high S as well, because they're going to pull the people in to actually get the task completed as well. So high S's, they're very supportive. These individuals are really good at making sure that things are done in a detailed capacity. They will always be sincere with you. They will always move things forward. You can always count on these individuals because they're people pleasers. Now, at the same time, they're going to move a little bit slower than your D's and your I's. Once again, not a bad thing. If you're a high D or a high I and you're working with somebody with a high S, talk to them about the timeline. Set expectations of that timeline so they understand it and they can hit what you're trying to accomplish. Now, high C's, they're cautious, they're careful, they're conscientious. They're going to go for the facts, they're going to go for the data, and they're going to understand it in detail. So they're very conscientious, but they can come across as sometimes condescending. There is no intention of coming across that way. It's just their minds work so much on the data and facts that they forget about the people side. And once again, not a bad thing, not a good thing. It's just that's the way they communicate. So if you are a high I and you're communicating with somebody with a high C, ensure that you're communicating with facts versus just inspirational messages. Because somebody with a high C won't understand the inspirational messages. They will understand the fact that you're bringing in and the details that you're bringing in. So we're going to go to our next poll, and this next poll is all about how you see the world and how you communicate.
I'm going to give it a couple seconds here as I see people responding. All right, let me share the results. Thank you.
Oh, we've got a combination here. This is wonderful. So we're neck and neck with influence and steadiness, and we've got some compliance in there, but no dominance. So, which is completely fine. So let's go into how we communicate in these areas. So when you're communicating, there is something called a style map that is based on a DISC profile. This is just an example. And this example is somebody who actually has a high D. So when you've got a high D and that is your leading communication type, you can see the green areas of individuals that you can communicate very well with. And that's other individuals with high Ds. You can see if you have a high D, your red areas are going to be people who are in the steadiness area. So those is where communication gaps are going to happen. So if you are in a high S standpoint, which we've got some people here, you're going to have a communication gap with high Ds. And you're also going to have a communication gap with individuals with a high I. And the main reason for that is because they're active communicators. So they move, they move, they move, they move, they move, and they move very, very fast. So if you're high S, and you're communicating with a high I or a high D, step them back and set out expectations and communicate. When do you need this by? What are your conditions of expectations around completion, but also the details? Now, always remember, you can negotiate that timeline if you need more time. But if they say, no, I need it this moment, at this now, say, okay, I've got other priorities. Let me see if I can move those priorities along. It's all about setting expectations with your high Ds and your high Is. If you're high C, you're going to communicate. There's going to be some gaps with a high D and a lot of gaps with a high I. And that's because your high Is are all about people. And high Cs are about the task and being methodical about how you plan things out. Whereas your high Is are not going to necessarily plan things out in the detailed level that a high C would. Now, those gaps can also bridge and make a beautiful plan. So high Is and high Cs can work really well together if you're setting the right expectations. So let's go into a style map in a little bit more detail. So going back to the main one, you can kind of see how each quadrant will communicate. So, and if you see at the very top, analytical and assertive, somebody who has a high D and a high C will communicate that way. Somebody who is just a high I is going to be very persuasive, but somebody who has a high I and a high S are going to be supportive and persuasive. So you can kind of see the dynamics that are starting to come out of this. So When you are analytical and assertive, high Ds, high Cs, this is what they're going to focus on: efficiency. How am I completing that task? Because remember, these are task thinkers. How am I accomplishing all of those tasks that are set in front of me? Individuals that are just assertive, they have the high D. It is all about making this decision quickly, driving those results, and they can really be seen as being impatient. So those of you that have a high S, this impatience is going to cause a communication gap. So that's where you can set expectations and communicate those expectations on both sides. Pull the conversation in. So assertive and persuasive, this is where you tend to see a lot of individuals who are just assertive. If you remember, we went back to passive, passive-aggressive, we've got assertive, and then we've got those individuals who actually combine being assertive and being persuasive. So high Ds tend to be seen as aggressive communicators. High Ds and high Is tend to be seen as assertive communicators. So if we continue to go around this wheel, you're going to see those that just have a high I as very optimistic. Anything can be done if we just put our minds to it. We all know people like that. Supportive and persuasive, they are going to be the individuals who actually will be the ones doing a lot of work. They're team players. They will do what it takes, whatever it takes, to make sure that there's good customer service. They're the individuals that will say the customer is always right, even when the customer is wrong. So very supportive individuals, you will tend to see them very stable and very structured. They are great people to actually build processes and follow those processes and work with individuals with a high C to actually make a really good process work, because they're going to think, the high S is going to think about the people component, whereas the high C is going to be thinking about the actual data and facts. So if you can combine those two individuals, you're going to have an absolutely fantastic process. And that's the supportive analytical individual. They're very goal focused, but they're also very mindful of people, processes, and procedures. So then you go into the high Cs. You'll find a lot of engineers in this area. So, and that's because it's data and it's fact-based. If I was going up in a rocket, I want somebody with a high C planning out that rocket phase. I don't want somebody with a high I because they might miss some things. But I do want somebody with a high C because they value structure and safety. So that's how you interpret the map. So keeping those pieces in mind really makes a difference. So processing information. This is another area where people tend to have communication gaps. It's one of the largest ways that people have communication gaps because it's on how people process information. And we've all been in a room where we're wondering what is going on. So we're going to go over the different types and different ways people process information before they can communicate it out. We have external processors. Those are the people that are talking, because they have to verbalize their brainstorming. They have to verbalize what they're actually thinking of doing. So these individuals, you're going to see them communicating about a lot of different things, but not necessarily coming out with a strong point of this is what we're going to do next. So the other way of processing information is internal processing. And that's people who process the information in their head. They're not speaking about it, they're processing it in their head. So where the gap comes from. The gap comes from if you've got an external processor and an internal processor communicating with each other. The external processor is talking, and they're talking and talking and talking, and the internal processor is thinking, what are they saying? They're going in 5 different directions, not sure which direction they want to go. They're not making a decision. They're confusing me. They're confusing the team because there's too many directions that they're going for. Now, when an external processor is listening and communicating with an internal processor, the internal processor is taking that information and they're thinking about it, and then they'll make a statement. But the external processor, while the internal processor is thinking, is going, hello, hello, anybody there? What are you thinking? What are you doing? How are you doing this? So that's where the gap happens. So to prevent this gap, a great way of preventing it is saying, you know, I'm an external processor, so I'm going to be talking out loud, and then I'm going to come to a decision, and I'll let you know what that decision is. So that's how an external processor can support an internal processor. An internal processor can support the external processor by saying, just give me a moment to think about this, and I will come to you with a decision. An external processor, it's going to be really hard, but don't say anything. Let the internal processor think, because that's how they will come to a decision. Now, there's 2 other ways that people process information. Task-oriented. What are the tasks that we need to do to get to the result? These are all the steps that we need to take. This is how the steps that we need to take to get to this result. So you hear them speaking about the tasks that are involved. The other way is issue-oriented. This is here's the problem, here's the result. They're going to be thinking about how to solve the problem and what needs to be done to solve the problem. The task-oriented person is going to be talking about the steps to get there. So once again, this is where the gaps can actually happen, is one person is talking about all the tasks, but the issue-oriented person is, okay, that's great, but we need to solve this problem first. Then we can talk about the tasks. But the task-oriented person is building the tasks to get to the result. So keep that in mind. So as you're communicating, make sure if you are more task-oriented to drive that result and you're thinking of the end result, make sure you tell the issue-oriented person that I'm talking about the tasks to get us to this result, and vice versa. When these 2 processing people, the way they process information, can get together and get that communication down, it is beautiful to watch because they get to the best result the fastest way, because you've got somebody focusing on the tasks and you've got somebody focusing on what the problem is and how to solve it. So continuing on with another poll. And once we get information from this poll, I'll bring it all in so you guys can pull all of this together.
All right, I know that there's a couple questions on this poll. Thank you for those that I see that are answering. I'm going to give it a few more seconds here for you to get your answers in. All right, let me share the results.
Okay, wonderful. We've got a lot of internal processors, and we've got about, pretty close 50-50 in task-oriented. So thank you for that. So the next phase, because we've got a combination of all of that, I'm going to go over all of the information to really help you kind of figure out how to prevent some of these communication gaps. So we're pulling this all together. So we're going to quickly go over each step. Now, the things you want to think of, these are the influences of communication. Somebody's past and somebody's beliefs and their environment. And then we've got the component of types of communication: passive, passive-aggressive, aggressive, and assertive. And while we're going through this, think of your core values and attitudes and beliefs. Think of your type of communication. Then think what you lead by in terms of your communication: dominance, influence, steadiness, or compliance. Now, we had a lot of people in influence, steadiness, and compliance, so keep those in mind. And then information processing, external, internal, we had a lot of internal, and task-oriented and issue-oriented. So, and that was about 50-50. So what you want to do when you're communicating with people is think of each one of these categories and figure out, who am I talking to? If they're a high C, but I'm a high I need to bring more facts and data into our communication to actually help that person. And if I'm communicating with somebody who's a little bit more passive, I might want to ask them questions to be able to get information out of them. Or they are an internal processor, but I'm an external processor. So let me be quiet for a while and see what they're thinking and have them state it. So that's how you pull it all together, is by understanding your communication style in all four of these areas, and then figuring out what their communication style is. And that's by listening and watching them. So we are now at the Q&A standpoint. What questions can we answer?
All right, so once again, folks, please put your questions in the Q&A feature. And Lou, the first question is, what two types on the DISC profile that will have the most communication gaps between the dominance, influence, steadiness, and influence, I think that you talked about?
Yeah, the largest communication gaps typically come between somebody with a high D and somebody with a high S. And that's because they're opposite. If you remember the DISC circle, they were opposites of each other. So, because one is a people pleaser, the high S, and the high D doesn't care much about people and just want to get things done. The other large gap is somebody with a high I and somebody with a high C. So again, they're kind of opposite of each other. So think of the circle and where those gaps might happen. High I's is all about influencing an individual, but usually they take a more people focused, whereas somebody with a high C, they're all about data and facts. It's not that they don't care about people, they probably do, but they're going to make decisions based on data and facts.
Great. A few more questions, Lou. Do you have any tips and tricks about how to maybe assess what somebody is from the DISC profile when you're talking to them?
Yes. So listen to the words that they're saying. So somebody with a high C is going to be talking about data. They're going to be talking about numbers. They're going to say something like, here's an example of a conversation between my brother and I. I'm a high I with a D right below it. My brother is a very high C. So when I ask him, what are you reading? He answers, a book. And I say, well, that's great. What is the book about? Or what's the name of the book? And he'll tell me what the name of the book is. And then I'll say, well, what's the book about? And he will say stuff. So that is a dialogue between a high I and a high C. Now, if you're dealing with a high D, you're going to see them making very fast decisions, moving and shaking, all about results, all about results. So that's the best way to figure out if you're working with a high D. High I's are all about the people. You're going to see them engaging with lots of different people, having conversations with people. Your high S, it's all about methodical pace as well as people pleasing. And your high C, once again, all about data.
All right, a few more questions, Lou. Does
Yeah.
your DISC behavior change as you grow in your career?
It can. So there's two different ways to look at it. We all have our natural DNA of who we are, but as you go through life, based on your environment, if you remember, one of the influences that you have is your environment. You will make adjustments to your DISC profile to be successful in the work environment. So think of two different companies. One company is fast moving, hard charging, and another one is more about the employment experience. So your environment is going to change your communication style so you can be successful in that environment. So you will make adjustments. There's also times where you have a significant life event. And when I'm talking significant, it is woolly buckets. It could be a death of a parent, a death of a spouse, a difficult divorce. That can change somebody's DISC profile as well.
All right. Next question. When you have ongoing struggles with people that are in each other's red, do you have any techniques that can be used to help them close that gap?
Yes, a big part of it is being vulnerable enough to sit down with the individual and talk through some of those challenges. Now, we have a group here of a number of assertive individuals, and so that will actually help. And what you want to do is just say, we seem to be having a communication gap, and I want to close that gap so we can work together to drive the results that we need to. And just kind of going through and acknowledging your own style as well as their style. And sometimes it does help to bring in a third party to say, these are the areas, somebody who's very familiar with DISC, that can help you bridge those gaps. And both of you take a DISC profile so you can kind of see that. It's a tool where you can talk about not the individual as an individual, but about their style of communication and how it's creating gaps.
All right. This question, Lucinda, is a follow-on, I think, from the previous question about if your DISC behavior can change over time and in your answer to that. So along the line of thinking with how you answered, it seems that your communication style may be affected by how confident you feel in the engagement. That is like a bit muted when in learning initial mode, or being much more strong when you're up and running. So is that true when people grow confidence, or do you see that, I think, is the question.
Yeah. So confidence and communication are a little bit different. You can have a very not confident individual who is a high D. You can have a very confident individual who is a high S, but their communication styles are very different. Now, where you will see confidence come into play is the questions that an individual asks. And you will also see that in individuals who are more passive, they won't ask as many questions because they're it's not that they're not necessarily confident, it's just they want to just go with the flow and they want somebody else making those decisions typically. Those who are passive aggressive, you won't see as many questions from them either. So those that are assertive, and we've got a large group of assertive people here, they're not going to be afraid to ask the questions when there's a lack of confidence in what they're doing. They're just going to ask the questions because it's about getting to the results, and it's also about bringing people in that communication.
Great. Two more questions, Lucinda. The next one is does your medium of communication affect your communication approach? Meaning, in other words, how does the communication need to change, if it does at all, when presenting to a group versus with communicating with just an individual?
So I'm going to ask a clarifying question on that because I want to make sure I'm answering this individual's question. So there is are you communicating through email, phone, or Zoom, or is it a different question that you're asking me?
So let me see if we can get that clarifying question. I'm going to ask the other question that we have to see what the medium with that makes sense to get that clarifying answer with whether it's over phone or whatever. The other question I have is, I am an internal processor. How do I know the external processor's desired results if they keep on talking?
Yes, absolutely. Ask the question of, start out with, I know you're still processing this information. So when you're ready to make a decision, would you please say the decision is X? Or if they're not making a decision and they're just talking, say something to the effect of, this is all great information and I really appreciate it, but we have to drive to a conclusion. So let's talk about that conclusion. And for an internal processor, that's going to be difficult to say that, but the more you use that, the more comfortable you will be using it. And it also helps the external processor bring their thoughts together.
All right, so going back to the previous question, just have a few clarifying things. So going back to, does your communication need to change when presenting to a group versus having a conversation with an individual? It's not necessarily related to being in person or online. It's whether about maybe the conversation is just a conversation or a presentation.
Got it. Okay, so a good example here is I'm an external processor. So when Jack asked that question, I immediately started talking, and that's in a presentation mode. So I'm already talking to get to the answer that we want to get to. If I was an internal processor, you're going to see some silence. I'm going to sit here and it's almost going to look like I froze on my screen. So somebody might be frozen on the screen, but more than likely they're processing internally. So when you're listening to somebody in a presentation standpoint, first indicate, is this an internal processor or is this an external processor? That's number one, because then you'll understand how you need to move forward with that. If you're the presenter, though, be clear about who you are. Like I said, I'm an external processor. So here's my words. If you're an internal processor, say, that's a great question. Let me think about that for a moment. And then state what your answer is. So it's all about setting that expectation up front.
All right. Thank you, Lucinda. That's
Mm.
all the questions that we have.
Wonderful. Well, thank you everyone for joining us today. And I'll turn it back over to Jack.
All right. Yes. Thank you again, gang, for joining. This does conclude our webinar. Please look for the recordings of our webinars on our YouTube channel and be sure to follow us on our social media channels. Also, if you have any questions, send an email to info@digineer.com. And please have a great day. Thank you again.